let's get started. I'll introduce myself and what this evening's all about, and then we'll introduce our guests. So, my name is Alex McMaster. I'm the host of the Across Divides podcast and also a co-producer with Susie Can, who is the Shared Island project lead at the wheel. Across Divides is a podcast that discusses challenges faced by communities around the island of Ireland. It's a part of the iCommunity project, which is a collaborative all-island project which supports community and voluntary sector organisations in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland to showcase and develop all-island collaborative initiatives. And it's run between the Wheel in the Republic of Ireland and the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action in Northern Ireland. So Across Divides has been running now. This is the third season. Our first season looked at both issues and opportunities that existed for the community and voluntary sector working on a cross-border basis across the island of Ireland. We ran the podcast in conjunction with the iCommunity report, which was launched around the same time, which looked at some of those challenges and opportunities for cross-border work in the community and voluntary sector. The second season of the iCommunity project specifically followed the Shifting Tides project, which was an offshoot of iCommunity, and that was a marine conservation project in Carlingford Lough, which was a cross-border project working through creative ecology and citizen science to explore connections with the sea. Now, the third season of Across Divides actually follows along from something that one of our guests is going to tell us a little bit more about, and that is the Shared Island Youth Forum, which was convened in September 2023. It brought together over 80 young people from Ireland and Northern Ireland, all born since the Good Friday Agreement, to hear their perspectives on how we can best share the island in a future that their generation will ultimately lead. Participants in the forum were aged between 18 and 25, and they were nominated by civic and community organisations from both the North and the South, reflecting the diversity of life on the island today. And that's something that we tried to represent in this podcast, and perhaps to take those conversations a bit further and to explore them in some detail, and also look at what conversations led to the outcome statement for the Shared Island Youth Forum. That outcome statement is available online, and it's hoping to contribute to broader discussions on creating a shared future for communities, which is underpinned by the Good Friday Agreement, which is still ongoing and still having an impact on how we live on the island today. So, in season three of the podcast, we spoke with young people specifically about what peace means for them over a quarter of a century since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. And for many of the young people who took part in the podcast, they were born after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. The issues faced by young people today are complex and interconnected, and we explored some of those through the podcast. We looked at challenges including climate change and mental health, unemployment and inclusion, culture and equality. We looked at identity as something that has changed perhaps in the way that it's thought about by young people on the island since 1998 when the agreement was signed, something that's complex and evolving. And while there are still some deeply rooted histories that influence identity, we looked at the ways in which it was increasingly shaped by openness and diversity as young people seek to define and express themselves on their own terms. So I'll stop talking maybe a little bit about what the podcast was about and introduce some of our guests. So the season included 6 episodes, which looked at a variety of different themes. We looked at youth organizations and the work that they're already doing to bring young people together and have their voices heard. We looked at some of the ways that youth voices could further be raised. And this is something perhaps that Nadia, one of our guests, will be able to speak on in more detail. We looked at climate change as an issue that's largely being put on the shoulders, perhaps, of young people who are being encouraged to take responsibility for an issue that's really enormous and global. We looked at mental health. We looked at culture and identity as other issues that are being faced by young people on the island. So to start off, I'll introduce our first guest, is Jessica Taggart. And maybe Jessica, if you would mind telling us a little bit about your work and about yourself, and also perhaps a little bit about what brought you to the podcast and the episode that you spoke on.
Yeah, Alex, thanks you for having me. So I'm Jessica, and I am an Amplify youth worker in the Northwest, in Northern Ireland, and that is with Youth Action Northern Ireland. So Youth Action is a regional charity all over Northern Ireland, helping young people, usually from the ages of like 7 the whole way up to 25. And my project is actually with 14 to 25-year olds. It's a peace project and it has 5 strands. So that is employability, citizenship, positive progression, personal development, um, and good relations as well. The most important one, we always forget that one. But yes, so that's a little bit about my work, but how I came onto the podcast was because I was a Shared Island participant that Alex had mentioned before. So I was nominated to the Shared Island Youth Forum in 2023 with an organization called Northwest Cultural Partnership. And they are based in Derry, and they do arts and culture across the border and across all the island as well through dance. So I was nominated by them, and the Youth Action were one of the lead partners, as well as National Youth Council for Ireland, uh, on the Shared Island Youth Forum, and that's where I actually got my job. So it was amazing. Um, Alex spoke there about the outcome statements, that we were helping loads of people, but also the Shared Island Youth Forum helped me, and helped a lot of people as well with their employment, with their uni. Like there was so many endless possibilities there. And really got me like focused on youth activism. I think I was always like focused on activism, but I never really considered it as a young person. So that's when our podcast came about just after Shared Island Youth Forum. Mark Clegg, my line manager, had came to me and asked not only can I do it, but if there was any young people as well that I worked with that could get involved in any way. And I said, yeah, I'd love to talk about them and talk about some of the work that they're doing. Some of them might not have the confidence just yet. I'm working with a lot of socially deprived um, areas, and with that, a lack of confidence comes from young people when they're chatting about issues in their communities. But I was able to talk about them, their experiences, and how good relations, even after 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, is still happening in my wee city today. So hopefully that clears it up, Alex.
Thank you, Jessica. And something that was really interesting that I think, Jessica, that you sort of, I guess, epitomize in a way is how a lot of people who work in youth work have actually taken part in youth work as young people before.
Mhm.
And the ways in which your experience of youth work has actually influenced what you do now for your job is something that was really interesting that came up certainly through the first episode of the podcast where we
Mhm.
really explored the way that youth organizations support young people on the island. So thank you very much for introducing yourself there. Nadia, I'll maybe come on to you, and if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and the issues that brought you to taking part in the podcast.
Hi, so I'm Nadia. I'm 16 and I'm from like the Mid-East Antrim area from Northern Ireland. So I'm currently a Northern Ireland Youth Assembly member, and what kind of brought me onto the podcast was my previous knowledge of just like the issues inside Northern Ireland. I mainly do work around cultural differences and just youth work in general and working with volunteer groups, for example. Just a wee bit about the Youth Assembly as well, just to give context. So we're a 90-member group, a non-political party who work within Stormont and work with MLAs to help make change in Northern Ireland. We are split into 3 committees: Rights and Equality, Health and Education, and I'm currently in the Rights and Equality Committee talking about women's rights in school. So what kind of brought me onto the podcast? I remember I saw it was just through word of mouth. It was a group of volunteers on WhatsApp from Northern Ireland, and someone sent me through a brochure or something of the podcast, and I just thought it would be a great opportunity just to talk about how youth work should improve and how youth work can help these kind of relationships between the South and here. And generally just talking about how important it is for us As I always like to say, the young people are the future. So spreading awareness about volunteer groups for people to get involved in their future for me is something extremely important. But I hope that clears it up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nadia. And something maybe, Nadia, that you spoke about quite a bit and or what we wanted to speak to you about in the podcast was your advocacy for a youth vote. And that's something that comes up certainly during the second episode of the podcast that you take part in. And it looks at how really some of the solutions that young people were bringing to the table. And we explored a whole range of solutions that people were bringing, including the recognition of a distinct youth age group where young people can have the freedom afforded to adults and the social protection granted to children. But we also looked at ways that young people were and were not being supported, calling out some of the interconnected challenges that are facing young people and some of the challenges, channels and platforms that they have to be able to raise those. So thank you very much, Nadia, for your introduction. June, perhaps you could introduce yourself and why you took part in the Across Divides podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So I'm June, and I'm actually currently still a psychology student in UCD, and I just finished my second year, so heading to final year soon. And by the side, I get to know about this opportunity because I'm volunteering under Jigsaw, which is the National Center for Youth Mental Health, and they kind of sent this opportunity to a group, and I saw that it's like a podcast. And for me, what caught my attention is the discussion on mental health, and I thought like um the main reason I wanted to take part is because I feel like I think it's quite obvious, like I'm not Irish, and I feel like a lot of international students, not just from my own country, might not feel like they have the equal opportunity to get mental health support in Ireland. So I felt like maybe just simply having my face on a podcast or my voice on a podcast, my presence would make people feel a bit more belong or more supported in that way, and kind of just spread awareness that even though we are not Irish and we are technically immigrants, we still have some supports right here that's available for us. So for example, like Jigsaw offers free therapy services, nonetheless, if you're Irish or not. So yeah, that's the main reason.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, June. And I would maybe come back to Jessica now with a question. And I'd be interested to hear everyone's perspective on this because something that we learned from the podcast was that peace means something very different to all the different people who took part in the podcast. So if you have a short answer, or it doesn't have to be short, Jessica, because we could write books on this. What, because you work with such a range of young people, what do you find that peace means for you, perhaps personally, and also for the young people that you work with? And what are some of the sort of diversity of ways in which peace is explored and expressed by young people on the island today?
It's so different from what it was 25 years ago, and that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. A lot of the times when people think of peace, I think I said in the podcast, whether it's or not, but have you seen the scene in Derry? There's really be like, what's the difference between Catholics and Protestants? And they have to write them on the chalkboard. And for a lot of young people growing up in Northern Ireland, that's what you get asked. And it's only now recently that that's changed and evolved to include more communities and to include communities that might necessarily have considered themselves Irish or Northern Irish but are living here. So it's amazing to see that young people are not just discussing when we talk about good relations, it's now good relations and diversity, and it covers things like race, and it covers things like disability, and it covers things like gender. It's so much more diverse, and it's amazing that way. did work with my peace program. The very first one that I did was with Down syndrome youth group. And even just to even talk to them about peace, something that never would have been done 25 years ago, because they're like, oh, they wouldn't know anything about it, but they do. They know about flags and communities. They know about areas where they should and shouldn't go to. Even at that, they're still aware. But I do think it's evolved a lot. And it's talking not just about being comfortable in the other community, but just in your own community as well, and being able to celebrate your culture wherever you are on the island is key to what peace should be and is making its way to be. So hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. I think that sort of hints at just what a diverse set of meanings peace has for people today. And we looked throughout the podcast at what peace can mean. Actually, a number of participants said you cannot have peace, outward peace, unless you have peace within yourself. And we explored that within the mental health episode in particular. Nadia, are you able to point towards what peace means for you?
Well, I'd say for me and the young people generally that I work with and I do youth work with, I'd say peace is something similar to what Jessica said, just kind of bringing everybody together as a community. I grew up different from everyone. I grew up in the Polish culture and I didn't know how to integrate that into, for example, my school environment. I always felt kind of separate from everybody else. So I think generally just being able to celebrate the cultural differences within Northern Ireland and Ireland is what I think peace means to me. I know it's a very short answer, but it's pretty simple.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And yeah, I think that's something that again we explored was it can be something really complex or something really, really simple. And sometimes the two are sort of interchangeable in a way. June, perhaps you could give us a bit of insight into what peace means for you and perhaps how we even explored it through the episode that you took part in, how we explored the idea of peace and what it means for young people on the island today.
Yeah, definitely. I think I have essentially a similar answer, but for my case, it's a bit different in the context because like I'm non-Irish and I didn't have a great insight of Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. So for me, it was more of like because I'm an international student and um for I think until now, maybe I still don't really feel I belong here. And even when I go back to Malaysia, I might not feel fully belong in Malaysia as well because I'm away for quite a long time and I get influenced by the culture here all the time. So I might not have the similar mindset as before that I had compared to Malaysians that study in Malaysia instead. And also bring back to I kind of got reminded of the riot back in I forgot which year, like 2023, I guess.
In
And that
Dublin,
was,
was that?
yeah, in Dublin. And that was just not long after I came to Dublin. And that was quite terrifying because I chose Ireland as a destination to study, also because I heard it's a safe place. And after coming here, and then just few months pass, and then I see the riot, and I was like, is this still a safe place for me to stay and study over here? I mean, but after that, nothing really happened to me particularly. But of course, like there was still kind of like an event that will always keep in my memory. And even just like daily life, I think it's quite common. Like if I go out to city center or maybe somewhere a bit more sketchier, I would still receive some racism reactions on the street as well. So I think peace, of course, like as Nadia and Jessica mentioned about to celebrate cultural diversity, but also being able to feel safe in an environment, being able to feel that you have the equal rights compared to others. And essentially, I think especially for youth, the rights to quality education for myself as well. And that's one of the reason I came here to study what I am still passionate about. Yeah.
Super. Yeah, I think you really touched on something there that was mentioned a few times throughout the podcast. Particularly in one episode where we looked at how the island of Ireland is largely considered as a peaceful place, and as a place where, you know, people can be safe, and that the troubles are in the past, and that that's the kind of violence that was encountered on this island. But we had a very deep conversation at one stage about forms of hidden violence that take, and of course you mentioned the riots there, which are very obvious forms of violence, but there are also forms of hidden
Mhm.
violence that young people encounter on the island that we don't maybe know so much about, and that prevent people from accessing essential services, or that exclude people from taking part in different platforms and forums where their voices might be heard on the issues that concern them. And part of the aim of the podcast was to be able to provide a platform, but there are several different platforms and forums and channels out there for young people to take part in, to be able to have these kind of conversations, and we talked about them in some detail. So I'd be interested, because you all took part in the episodes where you were speaking, in conversations with others who perhaps you hadn't met before, and who had different perspectives on similar issues. So I'd be really interested in finding out a little bit about what you learned from the podcast episode that you took part in. And almost as if we're going round in a circle again, maybe we come back to Jessica again. And Jessica, you took part in two episodes actually. The first one was on the perspective of youth organizations and how youth organizations support young people across the island. And the second one was actually in conversation with Nadia. So perhaps following on from Jessica's answer, Nadia, you might have something to add on the second episode, which was around youth voices and raising them on the island. So Jessica, could you give us something that you learned from taking part?
So much, learned so much. So yeah, the first podcast, I spoke a little bit about like opportunities that I had as a young person, and maybe lack of opportunities that I had due to Brexit. And one of the things that obviously come up is Erasmus, which is in the process of being back with the UK, and Northern Ireland, but not quite there yet. So I didn't have the opportunity to do Erasmus, but Megan spoke about not only Erasmus, but just being a European young person. And I thought I learned loads there that I wouldn't have learned before. And something I'm quite like envious of is that like in the Republic of Ireland, lots of young people at that age in unis are able to travel around Europe and experience things, even other things that are like any youth exchanges. Right now, I'm trying to do youth exchanges with my young people because they're funded through Erasmus. I'm not able to do that, even though they have Irish passports, even though they are considered Irish, they're then told that they're not. So I say I'd learned loads there about being a European citizen. And then in my second podcast, I learned loads from Nadia, and she spoke a lot about the youth assembly, which again didn't have as a young person, and it started 2020, like just after COVID, roughly. I can't remember now, but yeah, just after COVID. And I was like, oh God, I would have loved that when I was younger. Like I would have thrived there. So it's so amazing that them opportunities are coming through, again. So learned so much, and it was just so interesting to hear other people's perspectives. Um, because I always chat about being from Derry and how rural and how it's always Belfast centric and Dublin centric. That wasn't the case here at all in any of this podcast. It was so broad, and had so many different layers of all parts of the island, which was probably my favorite part of it. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jessica. Nadia, should we come on to you, and perhaps you have something to add to what Jessica was saying there?
So yeah, it was so nice talking to Jessica on the podcast. It was fabulous. One thing I definitely learned was that I'm kind of more privileged. I live very close to the Belfast area, so transport is honestly no problem. But one thing I learned is that youth organizations need to make more effort to try and include people from more rural areas, or even areas such as Derry, which are quite far away from Belfast, as I wouldn't have known. But just trying to get as many voices as you possibly can and just not trying to stay central to the main capital city. I don't know what the youth work kind of would look like in Dublin, but I'm gonna assume it's such a big country, it might as well be the same. A lot of stuff might be centric to the capital city, and I just think they really need to branch out. They really need to look at other people's opinions and try their best to get a wide range of young people from all across the Ireland. But mostly, I think mostly what we touched on the podcast, I was mostly familiar with, and I definitely really appreciate the views of Jessica. But thank you so much.
Brilliant. I think that's something that's really interesting that we recognize, and it's important maybe to point out that the podcast was recorded in Belfast, and it was actually recorded in Youth Action Northern Ireland, in their podcast studio, and for many of the participants coming from across the island, some of them hadn't been to Belfast before. Some who lived in Belfast had never been to Dublin before, and actually, transport was a challenge that we encountered. Was getting people to Belfast to take part in the podcast, and we had a couple of people coming from the other side of the island who had to travel and stay overnight. Even though it's not a huge island that we live on, and train links and transport for people with disabilities, was something that we encountered as a challenge for participation in the podcast. And I remember, June, that you came up from Dublin for the day, and it was the first time you'd been to Belfast, which was the case for several of the participants who came up from Dublin and other parts of the Republic of Ireland. So perhaps, and I'm aware that in this episode, Jessica and Nadia, you both live in Northern Ireland, and June, you're living in Dublin in the south. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit as well about some of the things that you and your fellow podcast guests, discussed, and perhaps what you learned from each other, throughout the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. To be honest, I think I learned a lot, like especially as a non-Irish, and only stay in Dublin for like 2 years, and and I'm going to Belfast, which was, I think, like the trip itself is an exploration for me. But particularly in the podcast, what struck me most is more of the Irish culture and the conflict that, between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland, and they are, how would I put this? Like, I don't know if it's suitable to call it identity crisis, like whether they feel they are Irish or British kind of, and whether they feel belong and connected to like Republic of Ireland as well, compared like with the border between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland. That's something that I didn't really know a lot about, even though I do, like, it was just few days before the podcast session, and I just kind of came across a video on YouTube talk about this Brexit stuff, and taking Ireland as one of the examples, but it was just a very brief explanation. And like just after that, and I go to the podcast, and suddenly I got to talk to Northern Irish and actually ask them about their opinions, whether how do they feel about this political change and whatsoever that's happening. So I think that's something I really, really learned a lot from. And another thing, of course, like Irish culture that you mentioned. I think I talked to this girl, I forgot her name, but she said she was studying in a school that used Irish fully, and didn't use like English to teach all the programs. And we also mentioned about some areas in Ireland that's completely Irish, even like including the root signs as well. I think that's something that I didn't know about it at all, because I'm only in Dublin, and the environment always tells me that even though Irish is still a national language, it's a traditional language, and people still learn it in their living cert. But apparently, at least most of the Irish people that I encounter in UCD, they don't really speak it, and they kind of give me this impression that they don't really like speaking Irish as well, and their primary language is still English. So like hearing about that is still a surprise for me, and kind of how do I put it? It's like I made me realize that uh, actually Irish is still very ingrained in Ireland, not just geographically, but also in terms of education and culture as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was, I think, something that came up again and again during the podcast was about how young people kind of gain an understanding of each other's perspectives on issues, because not everyone is taking part in youth work and forums and these kinds of projects and platforms. And we explored how social media and the internet are such tools for young people to learn about each other, and not just, you know, we had a couple of sort of funny chats. I think it was in the first episode we had a whole conversation about what Gen Z meant and what Boomer meant and what all these different things meant. And in that we talked about social media and how it's used and how it's perceived, and how it's perceived often as sort of, you know, young people on their phones, sort of not looking at where they're going. But in many cases, a lot of the young people who took part in the podcast were so well informed on what was going on in the world, what was going on for young people around them, on both sides of the border, all across the island, and throughout the rest of the world. They were really aware of what was happening because of social media and the internet and these forms of learning, and just how accessible those forms of learning are is something that we looked at. So raising those kinds of we explored social media as an empowering tool for young people, and youth empowerment is something that really the podcast was looking at exploring, and that the Shared Island Youth Forum looked at exploring, sort of means of further empowering young people to have their voices heard and to be able to really take part in discussions on the issues that affect them. Because something that came up again and again was young people are super well informed on things. So I have a question here, and I'll maybe break the classic circle and skip Jessica and come to Nadia, if that's okay, which is to look at what is needed now for youth voices to be empowered and strengthened and platformed on the island. This podcast was one small way of doing it. And there are other forums out there, but what for you is the priority, Nadia, to have young people's voices heard and responded to?
Well, the most basic answer would be involve them, more youth organizations, more opportunities for them to come and speak to the people making the decisions for them. I'm so blessed to be in the youth assembly, but I know that I am speaking for a very large amount of people who unfortunately do not have the opportunity to go speak to them. As much as they say they are open to talking to anybody, it is a very weird process. It's always when you send an email, someone else will reply in their name. And it's just a very complicated process just to talk to someone and get your voice heard. So definitely more opportunities for young people from all across Northern Ireland and Ireland to go speak to the decision makers, to the MLAs, to the ministers, and just put their voices forward. And definitely more youth organizations just to amplify their voices as young people. Again, as I always try to say, young people are the future, so not involving them in the decisions made towards their future is utterly useless. But I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, having that kind of responsiveness, we had a number of different things. If you listen on one of the episodes, we end up having a really long conversation about the importance. We had a lot of conversations where we talked about things that seemed somewhat intangible, and then we kind of said, right, solutions came up during conversation, and it showed how important it was to have these kinds of discussions. A little sort of sneak preview, perhaps. We had a very long discussion about the importance of listening and compassion, and empathy, and things that maybe don't seem entirely tangible to bring into, I guess, policy responses, perhaps. And the young people in the podcast came up with the idea of creating a department for humanity within government that has overarching reach over different departments, and brings them together on this central theme of humanity. And it might seem completely out there, but perhaps we need that kind of innovation to be able to respond to things that are deeply challenging, and run. You know, they're not simple and disconnected issues. June, I'll maybe come back to you already, on that question as well. Based on the conversations that you had in the podcast, what would you say is now is most important? Because you also take part in a number of youth groups and forums in Dublin. What would you say now is really important to have youth voices heard on the island?
Well, to be honest, I would totally agree with Nadia, to have more opportunities like this. But also, I feel like a lot of youth, they might not even know that this thing exists. I'm not sure how is it in Ireland, but at least in Malaysia, I think that's most case, like, because like I think there's also like cultural difference. Like in Malaysia, it's more the hierarchy culture is heavier, and they don't really prioritize on equal voices compared to Ireland, to speak it very frankly. So, but I feel like it's still quite common that a lot of youth, they might not even know that such opportunities exist. And even if they do have things to voice out, they don't know where to actually get them, and they don't know they do have the rights to voice it out. And maybe they feel, oh, I'm still young, I'm not adult yet, I don't really have the power or the right to point out these problems. So I think maybe especially in like marginalized communities, or as mentioned, like in rural areas. So maybe like even in schools, or or parents as well, to kind of raise awareness that these opportunities exist, and and also to encourage them to take part on this kind of projects, because I feel like even though these programs, they do exist, most of the time it's occupied by students that's maybe a bit more privileged already, and like communities that are not considered minor communities. So yeah, that's my opinion on that.
And thank you very much, June. And I like how you sort of connected in with Nadia there, and that was the whole point of having these kinds of discussions. And we only have three of you here this evening. Most of the episodes involved just three participants, but I suppose over the course of them, we ended up with 15 different people, and such a diversity of views and backgrounds, and so heavily informed by people's own experiences. People taking part in this podcast were not just talking about things that were sort of out there that they read about, but that they had directly experienced themselves and could speak to, and then further inform themselves on, perhaps through various different means. Jessica, I'll come to you with the same question. As and you're coming from a perspective of someone who's working directly in youth work, so you might have quite a broad sort of reach on this question. But I'd be really interested in also hearing about it from the perspective of your participation in the Shared Island Youth Forum, because that is something that linked so closely to this podcast, and what you think is now needed. We have the Shared Island Youth Forum outcome statement, and that has a number of things listed in it that have been raised by young people through the forum. What do you think is needed now to follow on from that, and to follow on from the discussions that we've been having on Across Divides?
Yeah, so like you had said about the Shared Island Youth Forum, the outcome statement took a lot of work. That a lot of young people did this voluntarily. I was very lucky that I started working for Youth Action, so I still got to do my job there that day. Like, well, I was traveling, but we all had to travel to Belfast or Dublin once a month and give. It was very draining as well. Like, we're talking about these issues, like we should have all the solutions to it, and it wasn't always that way. But we were so encouraged to think outside the box. Of like, a lot of the times you sometimes get down the hole of chatting about problems all the time, and it's problems, 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 whereas our facilitators turn around and be like, okay, but if you had the power, what would you do? If you did have this, like, what would you do about it? And just even like getting given that voice and being asked. There was such a diverse group of young people, and you had said there was 80 there. There was 40 originally, 40 from the Northern Ireland and 40 from the Republic of Ireland as well. So it was so mixed, learning about people's cultures. But yeah, we had things like a youth advisory board within the Shared Island Youth Forum, where there was a team of us. There was about 8 of us, I think, 8 or 10 of us, that were giving feedback on each day to make sure that it was okay. Each time we realized that the young people have so much knowledge that you spoke about, Alex. So sometimes the young people were on the panel with the experts because they were the experts. And just being given that empowerment is so, so important. And having them things like a youth advisory board. But I really like what Jen said about like all this youth activism is out there. It's the awareness that it's out there is the problem. So young people need reminded, like even things like the youth assembly. I wouldn't have knew about that before Sherrill Island Youth Forum. I wouldn't even have knew about any other organisations until it's not the kind of thing that's taught in school. So I think it's important that we're learned that we are learning about it in schools. It's important that youth are constantly asked, and being on advisory boards and being on we in Youth Action right now we're doing a program to encourage young people to become board members of the youth clubs. Why should they not be there? They have so much of a voice as much as the next person. So just constantly trying to find an in somewhere or being given that in by adults is my advice, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jessica. And like I said, all the answers that our three guests this evening are giving have come directly from the experiences that they've had of engaging with youth work and of seeing the issues that there are there, but also seeing the things that really work and that work most importantly for young people in order to raise their voices and to address the issues that they face. If you'd like to hear more about some of those issues and some of the solutions that are being proposed, then I would really encourage you to listen to the podcast. We've heard from 3 of the guests this evening, but there are 15 in total, and there are a massive range of lessons to be heard by them. And I should say that in many cases, the young people who took part said, if only the people making decisions could hear these conversations in full and could sit down with us and have these discussions. That was the thing that a lot of the young people really wanted. So if you can send this podcast series to someone who might be able to contribute to these conversations, please do. If you would like to as well, then there will be ways for you to do so through iCommunity Hub. We hope that the podcast is representative of some of the most pressing issues facing young people on the island today, and that folks might learn something from those conversations and also find ways of getting involved with them, that perhaps does some of that networking that I think that Jessica, you were particularly sort of mentioning there a minute ago, of making those connections between young people so that they can actually share their experiences, and that strengthens the messages that they want to give. So thank you to our three panelists this evening. I just having a quick look here in the chat, and I don't see any questions here. Anya, I don't know if you've any questions that have come up that I haven't spotted. That I'm definitely looking in the right places.
No, you're all good.
We're all grand. Okay, super. Well, then that just leaves me to thank everyone who attended this evening, and thank you to everyone who took part in the podcast. For me, it was a really enriching and interesting experience. I was knackered after the week of recording. I had to absorb everything that we discussed over those 5 days. So thank you to all of you for taking part in those conversations. Thank you to the Wheel and NIGFA for supporting it. The project is supported through the Department of Foreign Affairs Civic Society Fund, and we were massively supported by Youth Action Northern Ireland, and the Irish. I haven't made the note of it, and it's just slipped my mind. The Irish Youth Council of Ireland. Have I got that right? That's really bad of me. Sorry. Should have had that in my notes. I'm reading it off my mind. So thank you very much to all the organizations that supported it. And please do take a look. It'll be on icommunityhub.org. You can also find the podcast on most podcast streaming platforms, so on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts. So you should be able to access it fairly easily. And you can also find the previous series on there. So we have a whole range of episodes up there now, and each of the episodes is accompanied by a set of episode notes, which includes links to some of the projects that the participants are involved in, and it includes links to some of the resources that you might want to be able to use if you want to learn more about some of the things that are being discussed in the episodes. So we hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for attending this evening, and good night.